Experimentos secretos. East Rochester, Nueva York, a mediados de los 30 y principios de los 40, era un típico pueblo de obreros. John Musso, hijo de una extensa familia canadiense, era uno de los hombres que trabajaba en las instalaciones del ferrocarril, fabricando y reparando autos. Conoció a Rose, se casaron, se establecieron y levantaron una familia. Con el paso de los años, la salud de John se deterioró y se le diagnosticó la enfermedad de Addison, un desorden crónico de las glándulas suprarrenales que lo debilitó y le dejó manchas en el rostro. Aún con el estallido de la Segunda Guerra Mundial en Europa, hubo muy pocos cambios en la vida de John. Ignoraba que el hospital Strong Memorial, donde se le trataba como paciente externo, se había convertido en parte del esfuerzo bélico. El hospital era utilizado para las investigaciones del Proyecto Manhattan, la unidad ultrasecreta que desarrollaba la bomba atómica. El equipo del Proyecto Manhattan trabajaba en el interior de este edificio de alto nivel de seguridad, al otro lado de la calle del hospital. Solo se permitía la entrada de personal autorizado.
Research was determined entirely within the Manhattan Project itself, and it might be determined by Manhattan Project scientists here in Rochester, or it might be the result of directives that came down from Los Alamos or from Oak Ridge, which is where the medical chief was headquartered. The university would have no ability to look at what kind of research was being done here.
John Musso, al igual que los demás pacientes del hospital, simplemente desconocía las actividades ultrasecretas del gobierno y continuaba con las consultas de rutina a su médico para seguir con su tratamiento. La guerra concluyó en 1945. A medida que las tropas aliadas liberaban a los prisioneros de los campos de la muerte, el mundo descubre los horribles experimentos efectuados por los médicos nazis en los prisioneros de los campos, experimentos que casi siempre devenían en una muerte cruel y dolorosa.
That they were war crimes, that these Nazi doctors could have been tried for murder, was eminently clear. But the Americans had the ambition not simply of condemning a war crime, but of condemning a war crime committed in the name of medicine.
Tras establecerse el Tribunal de Crímenes de Guerra en Nuremberg para enjuiciar a los criminales nazis, la atención se centra en los experimentos que estos doctores efectuaron con humanos. Como resultado, se formula el Código de Nuremberg, una regla universal de conducta relacionada con cualquier experimento en humanos en los años siguientes.
The first principle, critical principle of the Nuremberg Code is you don't get to do research on anyone without their permission. The voluntary consent of the subject. Now, obviously, the victims of the Nazi experiments had not given their consent, and Nuremberg quite wonderfully lays out consent as the bedrock principle for human experimentation.
El juicio a los criminales de guerra nazis pasa casi desapercibido en Rochester o en el territorio de los Estados Unidos. El 1 de febrero de 1946, un médico que John nunca había visto en su vida, el Dr. Samuel Bassett, se acercó a su cama y le administró una inyección. John supuso que la inyección tenía alguna relación con la enfermedad de Addison. El Dr. Bassett no le dio explicación alguna. Pero la inyección administrada a John Musso no contenía ningún medicamento. Era una sustancia radiactiva, plutonio. John Musso era uno de los 18 pacientes utilizados como conejillos de indias humanos. A todos se les inyectó pequeñas dosis de plutonio extremadamente tóxico.
The impetus for the plutonium research was the result, more or less, of an accident that had happened at Los Alamos. A scientist, a tube of plutonium had burst in the face of a research scientist. He'd actually ingested some of the material. It was unknown what kind of effects that was going to have on this individual. But there were other concerns about plutonium, about its toxicity in general. Robert Oppenheimer and Louis Hempelman, both of whom were at Los Alamos, were determined that some human experimentation needed to be done to determine animal studies simply were not sufficient.
Los médicos querían averiguar el recorrido del plutonio en el cuerpo humano y observar su motilidad.
There's no indication on the patient record charts that these injections were ever given these patients. The research was top secret. It was not to be indicated to anyone, not even to the patients, as we now know.
Con plutonio venenoso corriendo por su sangre, John Musso prosiguió con su vida. Su precaria salud era una molestia constante.
It was a constant battle for him to maintain his equilibrium and to fight off very common everyday ailments like colds or infections. He had a very, very severe problem in doing that. And we attributed that to Addison's disease.
El 21 de junio de 1973, a los 72 años de edad, a John Musso se le convoca de nuevo al Strong Memorial y, por primera vez, 26 años después, se le informa acerca de la inyección de plutonio. Se le pidió que se sometiera a algunas pruebas de seguimiento y aceptó. Musso no le contó a nadie acerca de las pruebas con plutonio. El 6 de mayo de 1984, a los 82 años, John Musso falleció y se llevó su fatídico secreto a la tumba. Pero la historia no murió con él. Algunos años después y a muchos kilómetros de distancia, Eileen Wellsom, una periodista del Albuquerque Tribune, analizaba algunos documentos que ahora eran de libre acceso.
I was thumbing through the reports. My eye fell on a footnote, and it said something about human beings who had been injected with plutonium. And I was dumbfounded by this. You have to keep in mind the context in which I was looking at these records. I was all alone in this dusty basement. These reports were 40 and 50 years old, and they were all about dogs who had been injected or ingested with plutonium and had developed tumors and all kinds of diseases and then were sacrificed. So when I saw this reference to humans being injected with plutonium, I immediately thought, my God, how could they have done this? And what happened to these people? So I went back to the paper, and that following Monday I came in and I told the city editor, I said, hey, I found a great story. And I said, 18 people were injected with plutonium during the Manhattan Project. And he said, well, that's a great story, but that's not what we hired you to look into.
Pero Eileen no se rindió. Durante los 5 años siguientes, con calma y perseverancia, Wellsom continuó con sus investigaciones y solicitó más documentos de libre acceso bajo el amparo del Acta de Libertad de Información.
I got a few fact sheets, very few documents on the experiment, and they said that was all they had. But by then, I knew from other sources that they must have had a tremendous amount of information, and that they were simply blowing me off.
5 años habían pasado desde que Eileen descubriera los nombres de 5 de los 18 pacientes. Uno de ellos era John Musso, de Rochester, Nueva York. Buscó a todos los Musso en el directorio de Rochester y comenzó a llamarlos.
To know a John Musso in the area, he would have been about in his 70s or so, maybe close to 80 when he died. He suffered from a disease called Addison's disease. Do you think that he would be amenable to talking with me? And you have his telephone number?
I was shocked. I didn't want to accept it. I guess I was kind of rude. I mean, I didn't know nothing about it. And I said, you know, what, this can happen in the United States of America? They're going to treat my father like this? They're going to put this stuff in him? And I got kind of rowdy. I said, I don't want nothing to do with it. You know, it just hit me so hard and so bad that I couldn't think right. I cried. I couldn't handle it. I just couldn't handle it. See, my father never told me. I never knew that this happened to him.
After the initial shock, the anger set in, and the disillusionment, the distrust of the government.
Something was stolen from my father. We don't know what opportunities that could have come about after this Addison disease if he didn't have this plutonium. I mean, there's maybe, like, I felt like I got cheated. I got cheated that we didn't go fishing as much as we did. I got cheated we didn't go hunting as much as we did. That he wasn't there when I played the sports to watch me play. My dad wasn't there. I felt like I got cheated a little bit. I mean, maybe you're saying it sounds selfish, but I don't think it's being selfish because you want to be with your dad. And like other people in the block always used to take me with them, but it wasn't my dad. It wasn't my dad. So that feeling I just thought about came out. You know, what if?
Nadie sabe con certeza el efecto que tuvo el plutonio en la vida de John Musso o en la de cualquiera de los otros 17 pacientes, pero su historia ciertamente logró sacudir los cimientos del gobierno federal. Poco tiempo después del fin de la Segunda Guerra Mundial, el público estadounidense estaba sumido en el fragor de la Guerra Fría.
Let's face it. The threat of hydrogen bomb warfare is the greatest danger our nation has ever known. Enemy jet bombers carrying nuclear weapons can sweep over a variety of routes and drop bombs on any important target in the United States. The threat of this destruction has affected our way of life in every city, town, and village from coast to coast.
La carrera nuclear por una bomba atómica superior llevó a la ciencia hacia nuevas fronteras y con ello los experimentos con seres humanos tomaron una nueva dimensión. Entre 1951 y 1963, los Estados Unidos realizaron 925 pruebas de bombas atómicas y de hidrógeno en la atmósfera y en lugares subterráneos en el desierto de Nevada. Se ha establecido, según documentos oficiales ahora de libre acceso, que en dichas pruebas participaron en total 200.000 efectivos militares. 3.000 de ellos sirvieron en los sitios de prueba como sujetos de investigación, ya que el ejército quería averiguar el comportamiento de las tropas en un campo de batalla nuclear. Casi todos eran soldados que obedecían órdenes impartidas por sus oficiales superiores. Muy pocos se ofrecieron como voluntarios.
How about radiation? Do you think there's much danger from radiation?
Well, radiation is the least of the worries that the men are thinking about.
I think most people thought that radiation was the greatest danger, didn't they? Where did they learn different?
We were, prior to our instructions here, we received a very thorough briefing before we even came in this close to contact with it.
You feel that those instructions have given you confidence in your ability
Very much
to...
so.
Uno de los soldados en estas trincheras era el piloto Chuck Brody.
We met in 1948. I was spending my vacation in San Francisco and with a couple of other ladies from our office, and we went to the Officers Club for dinner. I met these 3 officers, and we sat around a table and the music was playing. Chuck finally asked me to dance. That was it. I just clicked. He proposed to me that night without ever even touching me or kissing me or anything. He said, I've waited all my life for someone like you.
Poco después, Chuck y Pat se casaron y ella se convirtió en la orgullosa esposa de un militar. En 1957, Estados Unidos planeaba detonar lo que sería la mayor bomba atómica probada en la atmósfera, cuyo nombre clave era Hood. Chuck estaba allí, cerca del lugar de la explosión.
He was in the front row trenches. There were ground officers there and there were pilots. They would rotate. The Marine Corps wanted all of their people to know about the safety of radiation exposure, so they could go back and teach the troops how safe it was. He didn't tell me anything. He was sworn to secrecy along with all of the other men. They were told that if they talked about their experiences, that they would be guilty of treason.
Pero la noche anterior a la explosión de Hood, Chuck llamó por teléfono a Pat.
He said, get the kids up at 4:30 in the morning and face the east, and you'll see something you'll never forget. I saw Hood. I saw this bright light in the sky, which slowly diminished. That's the only time he ever talked about that experience.
En 1963, las pruebas nucleares en la atmósfera llegaron a su fin por un tratado de prohibición de pruebas. Los soldados volvieron a casa, a sus bases y familias. Tiempo después, muchos se retiraron e iniciaron su vida como civiles. Los documentos acerca de los posibles efectos de su exposición a las mortales radiaciones se mantienen en secreto. Asimismo, se mantiene en secreto la información acerca de la estela nuclear llevada por los vientos, el polvo, las nubes y la lluvia que en los años 50 cubrieron a los Estados Unidos.
One morning, we woke up and while he was applying his underarm deodorant, he noticed there was a large lump under his arm. And so we immediately went to the doctors.
Los doctores realizaron pruebas que demostraron que Chuck padecía de una forma incurable de cáncer llamada linfosarcoma. El médico se lo informó a Pat por teléfono.
I was totally unprepared, of course, and I didn't know what to do. I was there alone in the house. I tried to figure out how I was going to tell the kids. We have 4 children. How was I going to tell Chuck? So I managed to do all that. And so we then went to an oncologist, and he started chemotherapy, and he did pretty well for the first 6 months. And then it was downhill. He died of lymphoma. I was devastated. My children were, his family, his brothers and sisters. It was such a waste, such a horrible waste.
Chuck, quien estuvo expuesto a las radiaciones en 1957, murió 20 años después. Pat esparció sus cenizas cerca de su casa, en esta playa al sur de California.
Before he died, he contacted an attorney. It was at that time, for the first time, Chuck told me something about his exposure.
Pat y su abogado escudriñaron en la declaración de Chuck acerca de su exposición a las radiaciones. Tratar de tener acceso a la información clasificada se convertiría en una agónica e interminable batalla contra el gobierno federal. Pat pasaría largos años de investigaciones y procedimientos legales solo para obtener los registros militares y médicos de su esposo. Pero no está sola. Miles de otras familias de veteranos atómicos pasan años pidiendo la liberación de archivos del gobierno para tratar de demostrar que merecen alguna clase de compensación.
The government is waiting for us all to die. Most of the men have already died, or they're on their way. There's a lot of widows that have died. We're all old. The women don't know the history of this whole thing. There are no records, and when they ask for compensation for disability and indemnity compensation from the VA, they say, prove it. They've got the documents. We don't have the documents. They've got the proof. We don't have the proof.
El inmenso temor de los militares a una guerra nuclear se combinaría posteriormente con el miedo a la guerra biológica y química. ¿Y si los soviéticos esparcieran bacterias mortales en áreas pobladas o rociaran en el aire químicos invisibles que pudieran matar a miles de personas al contacto? Los altos mandos toman una decisión. Es necesario hacer pruebas. Bahía de San Francisco, California, 1950. Durante 7 días en septiembre, el ejército simuló un ataque bacteriológico a la ciudad. Documentos del ejército, ahora de libre acceso, revelan que, en 6 ataques en total, se rociaron en San Francisco grandes cantidades de una bacteria denominada Serratia marcescens desde un pequeño barco de la Armada en la bahía. Las bacterias, llevadas por el viento, se esparcieron sobre un área muy extensa. El ejército deseaba saber cuán lejos podían llegar las bacterias. Estos mapas de la época de la prueba, ahora de libre acceso, muestran la extensión del área cubierta por las bacterias.
The Army decided to do what was called a vulnerability test program. And the effort was over a period of 20 years, actually, between 1949 and 1969, when hundreds of tests were conducted over populated areas to see whether, by spraying germs and certain chemicals, whether they would endanger a large population. Now, the Army did spray a lot of bacteria around, although they weren't the highly dangerous kind that would be used as an actual weapon. The bacteria that they used did have some health risks.
Quizás el ataque invisible habría pasado inadvertido, pero sucedió lo inesperado. Pocos días después, 11 personas ingresaron al Centro Médico Stanford en San Francisco. Todas estas personas sufrían de una severa infección bacteriana. Uno de los pacientes, Ed Nevin, murió.
I was 9 years old in 1950 when he died. My mother was a nurse. She was actually helping to attend to him. And it was a terrible sickness. He was going from high fevers to chills. He had hallucinations. And so it was a very, very serious infection and fever that was causing all that in him.
La infección por Serratia marcescens era tan extraña para los médicos y científicos en el hospital que 3 de ellos se reunieron para escribir un artículo al respecto. En ese momento los médicos ignoraban las pruebas que el ejército había realizado utilizando la misma clase de bacteria unos días antes. El artículo científico se publicó en octubre de 1951 en el Boletín de la Asociación Médica Estadounidense, pero pocas personas lo leyeron. Sin embargo, el ejército sí leyó el artículo y un equipo de 4 científicos militares examinaron el caso.
Some months after, they concluded, and this is a very strange conclusion, that the Army's bacteria and the bacteria that caused the infections in the hospital were not of the same strain or the same nature, and that any relationship was apparently coincidental. That was a real stretch.
Pasarían otros 25 años para que la historia finalmente saliera a la luz pública.
I carried the morning paper on December 22nd, 1976 to the BART station. I was reading the front page and read with some interest because of my work as a trial lawyer. The front page told a story of testing that was done in 1950 in San Francisco. I was surprised, but actually somewhat cynical as a trial lawyer. Nothing surprises me anymore was sort of my then 35-year-old attitude. I turned the page and was shocked to find my grandfather's picture. And they related the story that in fact he was the only one who died from the testing, that he died from Serratia marcescens, the very bacterium that was sprayed in the air.
Nevin consultó con su familia y decidió llevar a juicio al gobierno federal. El proceso comenzó el 16 de marzo de 1981, más de 30 años después de haber tenido lugar los hechos.
The heart of the case to me was that you can't test American people like guinea pigs. I mean, if we have anything in our country, we proudly look at with disdain upon the practices of the Soviet Union and the Iron Curtain countries of those days in the midst of the Cold War. So the heart of the case to me was this terrible discovery that we were no better than what we were describing.
3 meses después, el 20 de mayo, el distinguido juez Conti decidió en contra de Nevin en todos los cargos. Concluyó que la decisión del ejército de hacer pruebas se circunscribía a la excepción de funciones discrecionales, que le da inmunidad al gobierno de los Estados Unidos en caso de demandas por tales hechos. La Corte Suprema de los Estados Unidos confirmaría la sentencia.
What would have been required to win this case would have been to overcome hundreds and hundreds of years of tradition of governmental immunity that we got from England, and that was a king. And it was still a remnant of our law, even in America, with our form of government. And His Honor at least felt it became clear that we couldn't overcome that special protection the government has. You just can't sue the government for these important matters, says the immunity doctrine. And so what it would have taken to win the case would have been to overcome that immunity doctrine, and at least in these judges it wasn't so.
San Francisco no fue la única ciudad blanco de un ataque biológico simulado. Documentos clasificados ahora de libre acceso demostraron que 2 años después, una prueba similar, a una escala mucho mayor, tuvo lugar en la ciudad de Minneapolis.
This is the house I grew up in. This is 29th and Clinton. The school is behind me, about a block and a half.
I played on the playground. All of my friends were in the neighborhood. It was a very middle-class working neighborhood. Most of our mothers stayed at home. We're the typical 50s housewives. Our fathers were working. We were in and out of each other's houses all the time, running in and out the way children will do. It was a very nice, safe, secure neighborhood.
En el verano de 1952, el ejército convirtió este plácido y seguro ambiente en un lugar de pruebas al simular un ataque con armas bacteriológicas. Durante un periodo de 3 meses, desde las 8 de la mañana hasta la medianoche, cientos de efectivos militares rociaron nubes de sulfuro de zinc cadmio sobre Minneapolis.
Zinc cadmium sulfide is a material that's totally synthetic. It was created specifically for the purpose of doing these types of experiments because it was completely different from anything else that was in the air.
El polvo fue esparcido desde camiones en las calles y desde recipientes en azoteas, tanto en las áreas comerciales como residenciales. Luego el ejército registró la distancia a la que se desplazó y dónde se posó. Nadie estuvo a salvo de la exposición a las partículas de sulfuro de zinc cadmio. La escuela primaria Clinton, que ya no existe pero era similar a esta otra, fue uno de los blancos que el ejército roció constantemente día tras día.
It was a day that many were waiting for, a chance to tell the scientists about health problems.
En 1977, la KTCA, una estación de televisión pública de Minneapolis, reveló la noticia de la prueba del ejército y dirigió la atención hacia la supuesta alta tasa de problemas de salud en la escuela Clinton.
My first reaction was disbelief. I thought, no, never, this is not true. And I was in denial for many, many months. And during that denial time, I was really determined, I'm going to find out everything about this.
Y no estaba sola. Pronto se realizaron audiencias públicas. Muchos acudieron a escuchar los testimonios y también a los expertos. Los recuerdos de Diane comenzaron a aflorar.
I vividly remember being lined up, going into the music room. There was an older gentleman sitting in a chair with a light wand in his hand, and he was passing this over our bodies on the outside of our clothing. I started contacting my old school pals. I started keeping a list of illnesses. The bottom came for me when I found out that 4 of my pals that lived directly across the street from me on Clinton Avenue had all died of cancer. These are 4 separate families in no way related health-wise. They died within a year of each other back in the early 80s when these people would have been in their 40s. And I thought, well, this doesn't quite seem like a coincidence to me.
Al analizar los documentos clasificados ahora de libre acceso, Diane descubrió que médicos del ejército regresaron a la escuela Clinton al año siguiente, en 1953. Encontraron una alta tasa de asma, problemas respiratorios y algunos casos de pulmonía. Un informe de este mismo año del Departamento de Salud de Minnesota reveló que la tasa de mortalidad infantil en Minneapolis era extremadamente alta. Las causas eran la pulmonía y otros problemas respiratorios.
The toxicity of zinc cadmium sulfide is virtually unknown today, just as it was in the 1950s. If it remained in its native zinc cadmium sulfide state, it probably presents a low toxicity to people and to the environment. But we don't know to what extent the zinc cadmium sulfide might be acted upon by bacteria or other agents in the environment to break it down. And if it broke down, there is a possibility that the breakdown products are much more toxic than the zinc cadmium sulfide itself.
En la actualidad, no hay ninguna evidencia definitiva de que el sulfuro de zinc-cadmio haya sido el causante de las dolencias reportadas por los egresados de la escuela Clinton. El ejército aún sostiene que el químico utilizado en la prueba simulada es totalmente seguro.
They have not been forthcoming, they have not been helpful. The fluoroscoping they totally denied. And I kept insisting, I said, look, I have report after report from all various groups of students that remember the same thing. Then the Army said, oh yes, there was some fluoroscoping. So from the very beginning, it's been up to us to discover what happened, confront the Army, and we're still waiting for the medical reports that we requested 6 years ago.
The Department of Defense, their conviction that this is a perfectly safe material is an oversimplification, because we do not have any information about the possible long-term health effects of this particular material. Also, the viewpoints of the public who were exposed to this material and the anxieties that have been expressed by the public have not been addressed at all effectively by our government agencies.
It completely changed my memory of my childhood, which I thought was rather idyllic and very middle America. To know that these tests were done at my school absolutely was a shock to me.
Después de las pruebas en San Francisco y Minneapolis, el ejército realizó otro experimento para saber cómo se comportaban las bacterias bajo tierra. El blanco, el subterráneo de la ciudad de Nueva York. En un periodo de 3 días en el verano de 1966, agentes del ejército vestidos de civil simularon un ataque bacteriano a pasajeros desprevenidos en la estación Broadway del metro. En sus portafolios, los agentes llevaban bombillos de apariencia común, repletos de bacterias llamadas Bacillus subtilis variante Niger, microorganismos no tóxicos. Los hombres entraron en la estación del metro y aguardaron en medio de la confusión la llegada del tren. A medida que éste se detenía, los agentes abrieron discretamente sus portafolios, luego sacaron los bombillos y los dejaron caer al suelo, liberando bacterias en el aire. A diferencia de las pruebas en San Francisco o Minneapolis, no hay informes de algún efecto nocivo del experimento.
We can safely assume that while some people might have gotten ill, the numbers were not huge. Furthermore, the number of serious illnesses was probably minimal or maybe zero. We don't know because no one was monitored.
¿Cuántos estadounidenses han sido rociados desde el mar, en tierra o bajo tierra en un periodo de 20 años? ¿Ha habido otras pruebas similares en años recientes? Es difícil asegurarlo. Aún se guardan en secreto muchos detalles en documentos oficiales clasificados.
We don't know the precise number, but millions of people at one time or another during the 1950s and 60s were inhaling the biological or chemical agents that the Army had been spraying.
A finales de los años 70 y en el transcurso de los 80, el Congreso realizó audiencias y exigió la liberación de muchos documentos en un esfuerzo por saber más acerca de los riesgos de tales experimentos. La historia de John Musso y los otros 17 pacientes inyectados con plutonio a finales de los 40 ha terminado por hacerse pública. En noviembre de 1993, luego de 5 años de investigaciones, el Albuquerque Tribune publicó el reportaje de Eileen Walsham en la primera plana del periódico.
When the first installment came up, I sat there really expecting to be deluged with phone calls. I thought, this is so outrageous that people are going to call me. I didn't get one phone call. The story really didn't hit the press till Hazel O'Leary mentioned it at a press conference in Washington, D.C.
I would like to tell you that what I've been told about these experiments, what I think I know and have processed with respect to these 18 citizens of our country, leave me both appalled, shocked, and deeply saddened.
That if the government had in fact been responsible for, had been the proximate cause for harm or danger to the lives of any of our citizens, then the government ought to be in a position to own that and also to compensate for it. Now, the first time I uttered those words, there was a firestorm. I had no idea that anyone would think that that was a bizarre, strange thing for a cabinet officer to say.
La declaración de O'Leary fue tan inusual que los medios de comunicación se hicieron eco de la historia y el Departamento de Energía se vio agobiado con miles de llamadas telefónicas. Ella inició una investigación interna en el Departamento de Energía, pero la tarea no es nada fácil. Requiere de la revisión de millones de documentos en archivos del gobierno y depósitos en todos los Estados Unidos. Muchos de ellos aún son clasificados. O'Leary le expuso el problema al presidente Clinton y en 1994 el mandatario formó un comité asesor para investigar los experimentos con radiaciones en humanos. Pero el comité no investigó las pruebas bacteriológicas y químicas. Después de un año de intensa labor, el comité le presentó su informe al presidente.
If this committee's work is to mean anything, it has to be that 50 years from now, there does not have to be another presidential committee charged with investigating allegations of abuses of human subjects.
El informe examinó la historia de los experimentos con humanos e investigó las normas éticas, pero no logró satisfacer las expectativas de las víctimas.
Essentially what the committee did was say, these experiments are wrong, but no one is to blame. So they did not find one doctor or one institution guilty. And as far as this large community of people who had been abused and unethically used in these experiments, the committee recommended that only the families of the plutonium patients be compensated. They came out with a report that does have some good information, but families of people who feel that they were used in these experiments are essentially still at ground zero when it comes to getting these documents.
I think if I were on the other side, I'd be feeling the same thing, especially since the experiment, the effort had begun with such lofty expressions of ideals from me, from the President of the United States, and from Ruth Faden, who chaired that committee. We overpromised because we were so naive. We didn't know the government couldn't and didn't know how to deliver. We were all very naive.
This morning I signed an executive order instructing every arm and agency of our government that conducts, supports, or regulates research involving human beings to review immediately their procedures.
Algunos nuevos procedimientos ya están en vigencia.
there really aren't any serious risks to the study. A lot of people may have a tickling or a gagging.
Los médicos que efectúen tales experimentos deben explicar los detalles de la naturaleza del estudio y obtener el consentimiento por escrito del paciente.
Sign that for me, please, and we'll get started.
Things are very different today, and actually our institution doesn't accept any type of secret or classified research, and we also retain the right to publish on any of our research.
DVTs or deep vein thrombosis.
En los centros médicos de investigación se establecen juntas de conducta ética para discutir abiertamente y aprobar experimentos con humanos.
If by doing some great experiment or great project that the government proposes means compromising an individual's well-being, it would never get approved.
So today, on behalf of another generation of American leaders and another generation of American citizens, the United States of America offers a sincere apology to those of our citizens who were subjected to these experiments, to their families, and to their communities.
Given what I've learned about medical research and human nature and the federal government, that in 50 years' time, reporters will be writing about unethical experiments that were conducted in the 90s. And the reason I think that is because human beings are human beings, and there will always be a few people that step over the line.
Anyone who perpetrates an act, assuming that it is secret and will remain secret, has to know that sooner or later truth will out. Sooner or later we will find out. And so as you move to act, understand that if not today or tomorrow or even next year, eventually the historical record will catch up to you. And we will know what you did.